Welcome to our channel where we bring you the most amazing stories from around the world. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our videos. Have you ever noticed how some people always seem to have the perfect comeback for everything? How they can turn any conversation into an argument. And in the heat of the moment, it can be really hard to think of the right thing to say. So if this is something that's happened to you before, don't worry. Because today, we're going to share with you the golden rule of speaking that will help you in every situation. A few years ago, author and speaker Trevor Blake was on a flight that was delayed for hours. He was excited about the trip because he was going to be speaking at a conference and he was looking forward to seeing some friends. But as time went on, he started to get really frustrated. Finally, when the pilot made an announcement that they were almost boarding, Trevor got up and started to complain to the woman next to him. "What is taking them so long? I have a speech to give. People are going to show up and I'm not going to be there." The woman just smiled and said nothing. This went on for a few minutes until Trevor finally sat back down. But by then, he had worked himself up into such a state that even though the flight attendants had been incredibly nice and accommodating, Trevor was still feeling agitated. Just as he was about to board, he turned to the woman again and said, "This sucks. What should I do?" The woman just smiled and said, "This too shall pass." Then she got off the plane and walked away. At first, Trevor thought it was rude of her to walk away without saying goodbye. But then he realized that she was right. The delay was only temporary. His talk would still go on and his friends would still be there. No matter what happened on the flight, things would eventually get better. This is the principle that Trevor calls the baffle. He says that sometimes when we're talking, we need to stop and take a minute to remember that whatever we're upset about now won't last forever. Even if we're having a difficult conversation, it won't last forever. And even if it does end up being a big fight, it won't be the end of our relationships. Most bad feelings and unpleasant experiences are only temporary, but we often act like they'll last forever. So when we're in the middle of a heated argument or a tense negotiation, we need to remember that this too shall pass. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever met someone who always seems to know what to say? They never argue, and they can diffuse any situation. That person is probably following this simple rule. When we understand that most bad feelings are only temporary, we can respond in ways that make us feel better instead of reacting impulsively out of frustration. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just shut up. It might not be easy, but it's worth it. By staying silent, we avoid making things worse and allow the situation to improve on its own. Of course, this doesn't mean we should never speak up. There are times when it's important to express ourselves. But it's important to remember that words can't be taken back. Once they're said, they're done. So we need to be careful about what we say, especially when we're upset. It's also important to note that sometimes people push our buttons on purpose. They might try to provoke us so we'll react in a certain way. For example, someone might say something to us just because they know it will upset us. In these situations, it's important to remember that we don't have to take the bait. We can stay calm and not react the way the other person wants us to. We can choose to stay silent and not give them the satisfaction of knowing that they got to us. There are many benefits to staying silent. When we're silent, we give ourselves time to think before we speak. This allows us to express ourselves more clearly and calmly. When we take a step back and observe our thoughts and emotions, we can better understand what we want to say. As author William James said, "Think before you speak. If you think first, you won't speak second." Staying silent also helps us to control our emotions. When we're angry or upset, it's important to take a break and cool down before we say anything. Otherwise, we could say something we regret. Staying silent gives us time to relax and focus on our breath. This can help us to calm down and respond in a more thoughtful way. When we're silent, we're less likely to say things we'll later regret. This is because silence gives us time to think about what we were saying and make sure it's worth saying. When we take a moment to pause and reflect, We can avoid saying things out of anger or frustration that we'll later come to regret. Additionally, staying silent can help us to avoid misunderstandings. When we speak, there's always the risk that the other person will misunderstand what we're saying. This can lead to arguments and conflict. However, when we stay silent, we give the other person time to speak and share their thoughts. This allows us to better understand their perspective and avoid potential misunderstandings. By listening to the other person, we can show them that we respect their opinion, and this can lead to a more positive interaction. And finally, staying silent can help us to become better listeners. When we're focused on what we want to say, it's easy to tune out the other person in a conversation. However, when we stay silent, we give ourselves the opportunity to focus on what the other person is saying. This allows us to better understand their perspective and build stronger relationships. Author and speaker Larry King once said, "I learned very early in my career that you don't need to talk a lot to be good at your job. You don't need to talk a lot to be a successful communicator. Sometimes the best thing you can do is listen." There are also times when it's important to speak up. For example, if we see someone being mistreated, it's important to stand up for them. Or if we feel like we're in danger, we need to speak up and get help. There are situations where silence can be harmful. For example, if we're in an abusive relationship, staying silent can allow the abuse to continue. It's important to remember that there are resources available to help people who are experiencing abuse. Staying silent can also be harmful if we're witnessing injustice. For example, if we see someone being discriminated against because of their race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or beliefs, it's important to speak up against it. Silence can send the message that we condone the mistreatment of others. Therefore, it is important to find a balance between staying silent when it is beneficial and speaking up when it is necessary. In conclusion, the golden rule of speaking that will help you in every situation is this: don't be afraid of silence. Sometimes it's the best thing we can do. Silence can help us to think before we speak, control our emotions, avoid misunderstandings, and become better listeners. But it's also important to remember that there are times when speaking up is important. Therefore, we need to find a balance between staying silent and speaking up. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our videos. Thanks for watching.